Before we begin, let me warn you. In the final 24 hours of Marie Antoinette's life, something happened inside La Conciergerie that almost no historian talks about, a detail so disturbing that even the guards swore never to repeat it, and yet traces of it still remain in the prison records. You'll hear it soon. But before we get there, answer this in your mind. Why did the revolution need Marie Antoinette to suffer before she died? What purpose did her pain serve? And what secret did she hide, pressed against her skin until the very last moment? Keep listening, because the final object found inside her cell, a tiny, almost invisible thing, completely rewrites everything you thought you knew about her last night alive. And I'll tell you exactly what it was, but only after you see what led to it. There is also a second mystery, a single sentence whispered by her attendant Rosalie, which the guards accidentally documented. A line so strange that historians still argue about its meaning. You will hear that line too. And finally, there is the most chilling question of all. What did Marie Antoinette know about the fate of her son, and why did she never speak of it again? The answer comes later in the story, and it changes everything. If you're ready, we begin. They have carved her into a single image, the silk, the powdered hair, the drop of the blade. But what she lived through before that clean fall was a slow, small terror that hollowed a life into silence. If you want the untold story, subscribe and stay. Paris in the months that led to October 1793 smelled of coal smoke and the river in winter. It smelled of bread and fear. The city moved like a fevered chorus, voices rising and falling on orders that came from places far from the courtyards where Marie Antoinette had once arranged flowers and received petitions. Her name, which once opened doors and inspired songs in salons, now opened mouths to spit accusations. The transformation did not happen at the scaffold. It had been a long work, built of petty cruelties, of pamphlets and whispered bargains, of being watched until the skin thinned into a thing that could be read. She arrived at the Conciergerie by cart, not by carriage, and the cart itself was a public instrument, a slow, shuddering vehicle that showed the city how it had disposed of what it called privilege. But what the cart could not show were the nights before, the rooms with damped straw, the single guttering candle that made her face seem both smaller and more insistently present, the small private reliquaries she kept close, a miniature portrait of her children, a lock of hair wrapped in paper, the scent of lavender stubbornly refusing the salt and smoke of the prison. Rosalie Lamorlière moved around her with a tenderness that felt illicit in a place of official depravity. She was not a friend of the Ancien Régime. History would record her as a servant, a witness. Inside the prison, she became, for a time, a keeper of small humanities. She brought thin broth in a bowl and placed it on the wooden stool, watching to see whether the queen would taste it. Marie accepted the broth with the hesitation of someone who had been taught always to offer first, to show a measured grace. Her fingers, which in Versailles had adjusted lace and ordered jewels, now cupped the bowl as though it were a relic. "You must sleep when you can, madame," Rosalie whispered one evening, while the candle trembled and the sound of a distant carriage wheels scraped like a low complaint through the stone. The attendant's voice was steady, carrying the precise kind of courage that does not think of itself as courage. Marie looked at her hands, at the paper-wrapped lock of hair she had unfolded and refolded a dozen times. "I dream of him," she said softly, and in that statement the life of a mother lay bare, no plea for pity, only the ache that names a child. Louis Charles, as memory, as possibility, filled the cell with a presence the stone could not deny. Imprisonment in the Conciergerie was a choreography of deprivation. Guards came with lists and with eyes that attempted to file the last traces of a person into categories: enemy, spectacle, Example: they measured out possession by inspection. They cut hair to a length that suggested penitence and made the one who wore it look as if stripped of identity. The cutting of hair became, for Marie, not only a practical matter, but a repeated humiliation that rehearsed loss. Each snip was a small theft, a paper tag removed from a garment that would never be returned. Rumors crowded the corridors like a flock of savage birds. Printed libels, leaflets, caricatures of outrageous dress tightened the public imagination into a machine for forgetting particularities. The tribunal's case against her did not rely solely on proof. It relied on the city's hunger for a body to blame. There are moments in history when accusation stands in for logic, and theatricality displaces justice. Fouquier-Tinville led that theater with a voice sharpened by purpose. He did not require the weight of truth. He needed outrage recited, an audience that could not be asked to parse complicated motives. At the trial, the hall smelled of pitch and leather, and the crowd closed in, a living beast that fed on noise. The prosecutor danced between facts and insinuations, piling on the absurd, charges of debauchery, of extravagance, of crimes styled to fit the appetite of pamphlets. He spoke of letters, of secret correspondences, of meetings and foreign loyalties. He turned private tragedies into allegations to be performed. For the spectators, it was a spectacle, a court, a show, a way to strike at what they imagined to be the governing mind of their misery. Marie listened. She could not, by design or by will, unravel all the accusations stacked against her. Many were fabrications or conjectures embroidered until they looked like cloth. The most corrosive accusation, the one that burned across the printed sheets and into the crowd's remembered face, was less a legal charge than a moral pillory. She was accused, in the most obscene manner possible, of crimes against her own child. The tribunal did not need to prove such a thing if it could lodge the image in the public mind. Rumor would do the rest. The naming was less about the fact than the effect. To point a finger at motherhood was to provoke a nation to recoil and to revile. In the small hours after the trial, she sat by the window that opened on the Seine and cupped a cup of water, feeling the chill of the stone through her skirts. The city had been reduced to a series of faces at windows, a corner where someone spat, a group that cheered in the distance, the faint drumbeat of the Guillotine platform being reconstructed. Memory wove itself around the presence of her children, a boy and a daughter who had fed her laughter, debris of cloth dolls, an unexpected scrawl of chalk on a floor. She thought not of crowns but of hands, small hands pressed into her fingers, and of the time she had braided her son's hair while he slept and tried to pretend the world outside did not exist. She wrote when she could. Her letters were compact, folded with the economy of someone who knew each line might be read twice, once by its intended and once by a stranger with an ordering to discover treason where none existed. The penmanship was careful. The sentences were not grandiose pleas for martyrdom, but restrained instructions and a prayerful tenderness. In a short, steady hand, she set down what must be given to those who would care for her son if fate cut short their time. She asked that he be tended, that his name not be weaponized, that he might have a life not shadowed by her public fall. In those private lines, she retained her role as mother above all other titles. Rosalie kept watch through nights when the wind lashed the river and when the candle's flame fought to survive the draft. She learned to interpret the smallest shifts in Marie's breathing and to move without letting the guards see the way things were smoothed. An extra blanket folded at an odd hour, a bowl left half full so the queen would not be found with an empty stomach. Rosalie's presence was a small rebellion against the system that wanted the queen to be nothing more than a spectacle. Their conversations were spare and functional, but between them was an intimacy of habit,
The way Marie would tuck a lock of hair away before sleep. The way Rosalie would press the miniature portrait into her palm so it might warm by contact. On certain days, a visitor came with forms and with the ritual politeness of bureaucracy. The tribunal arranged examinations performed as if by right, the scribes scratching down testimony like scribes of an inevitable story.
The questions asked were legal in form but theatrical in tone, an interrogation designed to provoke confession or to generate the image of guilt. In the face of legal machinery that was equal parts law and performance, Marie preserved an economy of answer. When asked to speak about her past choices, she would not plead or rail. She would state simple facts with the displaced courtesy of someone who had learned to perform dignity because the world required it. "Madam," a prosecutor once said in a voice that aimed to sound like something between accusation and pity, "did you not attend lavish entertainments? Did you not live beyond reason?" She replied with a softness that was not weakness, but a refusal to be theatrical in return. "I have lived as I was taught to live," she said. There was a pause, as if the room listened for more confession and found only an ordinary woman. That ordinariness was, in that atmosphere, a kind of resistance. She did not rail at the crowd, nor cry out for mercy. She held the small center of herself and refused to surrender it to the mechanics of condemnation. Outside, market women and citizens converged in a chorus that had been fed months of outrage. Their voices were raw with personal grievances that had been given shape by leaders who needed scapegoats. They pounded the rhythm of revolution and demanded images to fit their anger. The mob was not uniform. It contained grief, hunger, fear, and the crude satisfaction of seeing the high fall. They wanted spectacle, and the state obliged them. The tribunal fed their appetite with accusation and ritual, and the city's collective imagination did the rest. Her last night before the sentence was to be carried out was a nocturne of small rituals. She dressed in a plain white garment that had been provided, white for penitence, white for the right the state afforded those it executed. The linen folded against her was clean, and looked, in the candle's wavering light, like a shroud laid on an altar. She allowed no pretension to ceremony beyond the simple order of clothes unfolded and refolded, of hair smoothed without the attempt at the former hauteur, and of a small private prayer that bore the tone of someone both devout in habit and utterly human in its address. Rosalie sat by the foot of the straw pallet and watched the Queen's hands. "Will you forgive them, madam?" she asked, not because she expected a theological response, but because the question itself might give some peace. Marie breathed out, a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "Forgiveness is not something given easily," she said, "but there are children here who have done no harm and must be spared. For them I hold what small mercy I can." There was a final letter, folded and sealed with a hand that trembled once and then steadied. It contained no grand declarations, no sweeping denunciations. It asked that Louis Charles be looked after. It spoke of love. It advised a protector to be kind. In the margins she wrote a note for the young ones. "Be brave and charitable," she urged, in the kind of parenting counsel that is as simple as it is eternal. The procession that took her from the prison was both more public and more private than anything she had known. She rode on a cart meant for criminals, the same cart that had carried many others to the place where the law pronounced itself with merciless finality. The city's streets crowded close, faces pressed at windows. Some spat, some cried, some watched in numb silence. The cart clattered over cobbles, and each jolt seemed to dislodge another piece of a life that had been accumulated in salons and private rooms. The scent of jasmine, the rustle of brocade, the soft laugh of a child. Those memories did not disappear. They moved beneath the rattle like a hidden chorus. At the foot of the steps that led to the scaffold, an ordinary man, Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, stood with the professional detachment that his duty required. In his hands, the instrument of death looked less like a monstrous invention than a sober tool whose function was to make a polity's sentence appear clean and technical. Sanson had performed the task before. He was a man no less subject to the same fears and small mercies as others, but he wore, publicly, an armor of function. The way he carried himself was not callous so much as bounded by the role the society had assigned him. As she climbed the steps, the sound of the crowd changed pitch. For a moment there was a hush, a human pause that is remarkable in the middle of a punishment. It was as if the city had collected itself, not to rend, but to watch. She mounted with the composure of someone who had learned to control the tiny gestures that betray fear. One small solemnity remained, the apology she offered in a voice heard thinly above the surge of the crowd. "I forgive those who have condemned me," she said, perhaps not the spontaneous utterance of a saint, but an act of closure, chosen in a place that demanded closure. "I go to my death uncondemned by my conscience." That line was not theatrical. It was a private summation of what she had chosen to offer. Not defiance born of bitterness, but a controlled assertion of being more than the sins the crowd ascribed to her. The blade fell shortly after, a movement described in many histories as precise and clinical. For those who stood at close range, there was no spectacle of gore to linger upon, only the sudden, blunt cessation of a life and an immediate scramble to assign meaning. In the days that followed, the city returned to its many murmurs. The fall of a queen did not fix the wider rot or repair the hungry winter. A mass grave received many bodies from the same season of terror. Anonymity and the urgency of burial stacked fresh soil over names and stories. The place of her internment was for a long time a fact of record and not of community memory.
Later, when rumor and art began to transform the raw facts into legend, the contours of that life found new shapes. Portraits, wax effigies, tales of a head rescued or hidden or taken by fate. Artists would, in time, render her face, soft and luminous in marble or oil, turning the facts of imprisonment and humiliation into something more marked by contemplation than by immediate outrage. Memory works in strange ways. Where once the crowd had demanded a body to blame, later generations would ask why blame had been so eagerly given. Some would call her folly, others would call her victimhood. Neither appellation holds the whole truth. She was not a saint nor a monster. She was a woman who had been raised in a world of courtly forms, who had loved her children with a fierce particularity, and who had been stripped by a process that aimed at annihilation of nuance. In private letters that survived, she appears as a contradictory, humane figure, capricious perhaps in youth, resolute in motherhood, measured in the face of the final humiliation that was meant to erase her. The motifs of her last days, the candle guttering, the cut of hair, the white linen, the cart jostling over stone, the wind that carried both the stench of the city and the sound of a nation, linger because they are the human-scaled things. They are the counterweights to the pamphlet's shriek and the tribunal's performance. What endures is not a definitive moral verdict, but the image of a person who preserved a kind of dignity despite the design to humiliate. She walked to her death in a plain gown and offered an apology that kept intact the essence of a mother. The blade did not need to be loud to be final. Its quietude was another cruelty, a rapid erasure that left plenty to be said about the processes that led to it. History will argue about causes and responsibilities and about whether any one life can stand for the sins of an entire order. But what she endured in those months, that steady narrowing of private space by the opinions of others, the repeated small invasions that amounted to moral castration, was terror in its most patient form. It was not the sudden horror of a single violent act. It was a prolonged wearing away of comfort, identity, and the capacity to be seen as human. There is a final image that will return in any telling. A candle's flame shrinking toward the last moment, not extinguished by hand, but by the inevitable draft of a closing world. She held to the small light she could manage: the portrait of her child, the last letter, the brief spoken forgiveness. In that holding, she resisted being reduced to the public legend the city wanted. The blade completed the city's sentence, but it did not complete what she had carried in the private rooms, in the hands that smoothed hair, in the small notes folded and sealed for children who would grow into lives shaped but not defined by the scandal.
Later ages would sift the pieces. Some would claim she deserved what she received. Others would set her up as martyr. The truth is more tangled and, perhaps, more instructive. She was a single human life caught in a larger machine that needed scapegoats and simple stories. What she endured before the guillotine was pure terror, not because it made headlines, but because it removed, step by small step, the ability to be recognized as a person with minor, ordinary loves. When Rosalie spoke of her in later recollection, she did not invent miracles. She remembered the neatness of Marie's final preparations, the slow breath, the way she tucked the portrait back into the folds of a sleeve. She was not grand in the ways they declared, Rosalie said quietly. She was a mother carrying sorrow with a steady hand. The city moved on, as cities do, and the immediate passions cooled into the material of archives and portraits. Yet the motifs persisted: white linen, a lock of hair, the bitter wind, because those small things are how human beings keep trace of one another. They remind those who come after that public justice can be performative, and that dignities can survive even the most methodical cruelty. What Marie Antoinette endured before the guillotine asks now of us a quieter judgment: to see people not only as symbols, but as composite beings. To ask, when a nation demands a body to blame, what other evils are being avoided? To consider whether public retribution can ever balance the slow terror of private annihilation. The answer is rarely simple, but the question remains urgent. After the blade had done what the tribunals and pamphlets had promised it would do, the city found new languages to speak about her. Commemorations and condemnations arranged themselves like guilds of meaning, each with its own ledger of facts and grievances. In the cafes and on the stairwells of private houses, men and women quoted fragments of speech and gesture as proof. What had been a single human life splintered into a catalog of proof texts: the gown, the tress of hair, the countenance in profile. Each fragment became a shorthand for an argument that the dead could neither answer nor amend. Rosalie watched those arguments from a distance that was at once intimate and peculiar. She had stood within sight of the Queen in the last hours, and kept the little things that could be carried without notice: an embroidered handkerchief folded into a cigar box, a scrap of ribbon, a pressed flower. They were not relics in the sense the crowd meant when it turned hair into token and linen into evidence. They were the instruments of memory. She knew with a clarity that did not belong to political pulse-taking that the trinkets did not translate into the lives that had been lived. They held at most the pressure of one human hand on another. Years later, when age had softened the sharpness of immediate terror into an ache, Rosalie would be summoned by curiosity and a new civic appetite for collections. Men who arranged curiosities and printed books came to her with requests of a certain tone, their hands stained with paper, their eyes hungry for provenance. They asked after facts with the thin kindness of people who keep libraries and forget what it is to keep a bedside. She answered them as she had walked the last corridor, simply by naming the small acts she had observed. She did not lend herself to myth-making.
When asked whether the queen had been proud in her final words, Rosalie would shrug and speak of a mother's economy. A short apology for wrongs, an insistence on the child's portrait, a smoothing of a sleeve. That economy resisted the temptation to be either spectacle or vindication. The young dauphin and the elder daughter, these were threads that the city tugged on and rolled into other narratives. The child's life, narrowed by custody and rumor, became itself a battlefield for competing virtue and vice. Some made of him a symbol of innocence ruined by revolutionary zeal. Others used his fate as blunt proof that no institution could be trusted. The child whom his mother had pressed to her chest had, in his turn, been pressed into the pages of pamphlets and the columns of newspapers. Those who loved him in the narrow private registry, nurses, attendants, the small cadre of aides who had not yet been expunged, knew him as a small, breathing presence who took comfort in simple things: a wooden horse, a tale told quickly after a long day. Such facts rarely put themselves forward in public argumentation. They had no large moral to suit the pamphleteer's needs. The archives that gathered in the years that followed were patient about nuance. Paper accumulates the fashions of interpretation as dust collects on a table. Letters once thought scandalous or trivial were later read for other reasons: a clause of care, a halfway apology written in the margin, a request for bread that had been deferred. Scholars and curious readers would comb those papers and discover, again and again, the disjuncture between the language of politics and the language of households. The state requires hard facts that can be folded into law. The household deals in soft facts that resist the tidy resolutions of statute. The queen, in Rosalie's telling, belonged to the latter register. It is tempting, when history grows distant, to assign a single moral shape to events. Politicians seek simplicity because it is legible. Artists seek it because it will read clearly in rubies and canvas. Yet the more patient accounts, the ones that take time with small things, argue otherwise. They insist that causes are braided and that cruelty can be both spectacular and domestic.
The violent overthrow of a court and the small, repeated humiliations suffered by a woman in a gown are related not by direct causality, but by an economy of exclusion. Every public demand for purity requires a private sacrificial body. Marie's life, her choices and inabilities, her charms and her indifference formed a knot that the nation found useful to unpick and display. In the salons that remained after the worst nights had ended, authors composed defenses and indictments in equal fervor. Some argued that she had been the architect of her destruction, a foreign woman who had failed to understand the precariousness of her station. Others, more indulgent, offered her as an emblem of monarchy's human face, tragic and misunderstood. Plays restaged her as a figure of pathos. Ballads tried to compress her into an earworm of moral instruction. Now and then, in the quieter corners of those same salons, a person would take up a different kind of conversation. How revolutions betray tenderness. How political necessity can be a blunt instrument against the fragile forms of domestic love. On the streets, the objects of her life became portable metaphors. The tress of hair, mounted in an oval frame and distributed among collectors, served as a tactile proof that the public had possessed what it hunted. The linen that had once wrapped a sleeping body was catalogued and stored in a drawer whose key turned softly in a gentleman's hand. Those who handled such things often declared themselves keepers of truth, as if the object could speak without witnesses. But the witnesses, those who had arranged the bed, smoothed the sheets, folded portraits into sleeves, had meanings to which the objects did not easily reduce. Rosalie kept house like a person who had learned to economize memory. She wrote down what she could in neat sheets and bound them with string. There was a disciplined sorrow in that practice, not to prove anything beyond the fact of existence.
She recorded, for instance, that the queen had asked for the portrait to be returned to the child, and that she had tucked it into the folds of a sleeve as if fearing that the official world might pry it from her fingers. That single act, folding a likeness into cloth, was not a statement of politics, but of the private commerce of consolation. It is the sort of thing that, when read decades later, unsettles tidy narratives. Outside Rosalie's modest rooms, the city constructed a new lexicon of civic virtue. Monuments rose and fell. Streets took names that were meant to teach the young what to value. Yet these public gestures, however earnest, never quite erased the fact that the citizenry's appetite for moral clarity required someone's life to be made emblematic and therefore vulnerable. The appetite subsisted on simplification. In time, when the passion of the moment cooled, historians would ask whether such simplifications were ever morally defensible.
They would also ask whether any political community could maintain itself without the occasional scapegoat to remind it of its identity. Rosalie's own life, measured in the tools of survival, cooking utensils, a well-made broom, the charity of a neighbor, continued. She mended garments for a living that was part necessity and part vocation. One does not become a seamstress without learning to attend to what others discard. Sometimes she would reach into a drawer and pull the small portrait, its edges darkened with touch. She would not parade it, she would simply hold it for a time and then return it to its hiding place. Her hands, which had smoothed the queen's hair in the dead hours, had learned to be modest about memory, to keep a thing and allow it to remain small. Such modesty is not indifference. It is instead a refusal to let grief be immediately converted into spectacle. There is a discipline in that refusal, because grief can be consumed into politics and then folded away by next month's cause. To keep a portrait in a sleeve is an act of fidelity to smallness, to the ordinary. It is also, perhaps, a defiant insistence that some aspects of life, motherly tenderness, private contrition, the arrangements made at the bedside, are not suitable for the marketplace of indignation. The city, as cities do, continued to remake itself. Children born after the tumult grew into adults who regarded the pulse of its fears with either inherited horror or inherited pride. Yet in the corners where private things accumulate, the attics, the trunks, the drawers of those who remembered, the past kept a different measure. There, reputations were not settled by editorial columns, but by the slow work of remembrance. Naming the small favors, citing a phrase in an odd accent, recalling a kindness done when no witness was present. It is in those corners that the true test of history's charity occurs. Will a nation choose to remember its dead as symbols that justify present needs, or will it allow them the messy dignity of consummate, contradictory human beings? The record suggests both impulses operate side by side. Monuments and biographies will argue for tidy morals. Cupboards and letters will insist on the stubbornness of the particular. Rosalie, when she could no longer walk the lane to the market, would sit by the small window in her sitting room and watch the light change on the roofs. Sometimes a child would pass who did not know the history she carried, and would wave with the casual confidence of a young life inside a city that had traded so much of its tenderness for political instrument. Rosalie would smile, not with a sudden nostalgia, but with the full, weary gratitude of someone who has stewarded what is entrusted to her. On one late afternoon, the light thinned to a pale that made the portrait within the sleeve look as if it were a thing half lit by its own memory. She fetched the small box, opened it, and let the portrait sit in her palm. The face on the tiny paper was not the queen as the pamphlets had carved her into the public imagination. It was a face accustomed to small acts, the feeding of a child, the smoothing of a forehead, the quick apology that aims less at public absolution than at the mending of one private seam. If the city required a lesson from that fragment of paper, it would have to be a quiet one. That the work of a nation's conscience may be measured less by the spectacle of tribunals and more by the attentiveness it brings to the quiet economies of care.
Rosalie folded the portrait back into its sleeve, locked the box, and set it aside, not as evidence for any future argument, but as proof that a life had been present in the world and not wholly consumed by the demands of posterity. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain and the distant, ongoing business of the city. Inside, the things that had belonged to a single life lay together, unadorned and unexhibited. Rosalie closed the shutters against the coming dusk and, for a few minutes, let memory rest without the need to speak. The small light of the room held steady. The larger lights of history would continue to blaze and fade. Meanwhile, some people would go on keeping the soft work of remembrance, and that would be enough for now.